Brother Dale Parsley is a 2003 graduate from the West Virginia School of Preaching. He currently serves with the Dewey, one of those D's. It's been a bad day. At the Dewey Avenue Church of Christ. You didn't hear what happened earlier, and I'm not going to tell you, Dale.
I heard.
You heard, of course. He and his wife, Angie, have 6 children: Caleb, Hannah, Elena, Carson, Grayson,
Angelus.
Yeah. And Angelus. He is also one of our faculty members teaching New Testament Church and does a fantastic job, and we thank him so very much.
If you would open your Bibles to Philippians chapter 4. Philippians chapter 4. I do appreciate the invitation to be with you, and I haven't been able to be here the whole week, but I have enjoyed my time here, and it's always good just to see some old friends and reconnect with people and everything. Unless you're a multimillionaire, I'm sure you are aware of the economic changes that have occurred in the past at least what I would say 4 years, right? You go to the grocery store, and what used to cost around $100 is close to what, $200, if not higher, right? At least that's the case for my family. I can go on about how prices have changed for the worse and obviously not the better. I was speaking this week actually with a preacher friend of mine. He and I hadn't talked in a long time. We were talking on the phone, and one of the things he had mentioned, and I thought, you know what, I think you're right. He says, I think we're going to go back, the day may come as a church, we may go back to an Acts chapter 2 church. And I thought, well, I think we're trying that the whole time. And he said, no, look at verses 44 and 45, how literally when the economic circumstances with the early church were so dire that they're literally selling their possessions to sacrifice in order to help out other Christians. And I wonder if maybe what he said there is right. Our church does a clothing giveaway every year, and I think it's great that they do that, and it's a congregational effort, and I really admire. Everybody in the church plays some kind of hand, and it's always a blessing to be able to help out people in the community and everything. This year, I noticed our numbers have nearly doubled in people coming to get clothes. Okay, and I got to thinking about this. A lot of times when you give in a clothing giveaway, it's a lot of times your leftovers, right? It's the clothes that don't fit anymore because, even though you're 40, you're still growing somehow, right? You know what I mean? And so you get rid of clothes you don't want or you don't need anymore. How many clothing giveaways and people that contribute to clothing giveaways literally go in their closet and give away their best clothes? We give out of abundance and instead of out of sacrifice in a situation like that, right? And let me mention one other thing before we kind of get into our text, and this is not for preachers. You can plug your ears if you would like, or you can choose to listen. I believe in, the previous lesson was a great lesson on contentment. I totally agree with that, but I'm here to tell you as members, if you believe in the golden rule on how to treat a preacher as you would want to be treated, a good salary, or what was a good salary 10 years ago, may very well just be a part-time salary. And I think there is a sense where we should consider that the day may come where more of us are going to be like Paul, preaching the gospel, but also being a tent maker as well. And there's nothing wrong with that. I think that's actually a good thing in a lot of ways. But when you think about difficult circumstances in the first century, I want to tell you something. I actually think they have it way harder than what we think we have it right now. And it's in that first century context of actually what we would consider pretty bad poverty that we find Paul closing out his letter to the Philippian church in Philippians chapter 4, beginning in verse 14 all the way down to verse 23. Here's what I want to do. I want to, in regard to the concept of caring and caring for others, and being cared for, because Paul is being cared for in text, I want to point out 6 things, or overall 6 lessons from this text, okay? Let's begin reading. In the first place, in verse 14, okay, there is a sense here where the congregation at Corinth, number 1, was seeking to help others. Notice Paul says in verse 14, "Nevertheless, you have done well that you shared in my distress." You know, Woos notes that this was the equivalent of saying you did a beautiful thing when you did that. The English Standard says it was kind of you to do that, right? And the phrase there, for instance, "done well," is found in James chapter 2 and verse 8 when it talks about if you love your neighbor as yourself, you fulfill the royal law. You do well, actually, there. And so Paul is in one sense, he's complimenting them, and in essence he is thanking them, okay? And because why? Because of how they have helped him. I'm sure if you've been here all week, you know exactly what's going on here. Epaphroditus has come from Philippi, and he has come to Rome to give Paul support, while Paul is essentially, as I understand it, on some kind of house arrest in Roman custody, basically, awaiting his trial before Caesar, right? While in the process, of course, Epaphroditus gets sick, and then, you know, he's going back home and everything. But the church at Philippi, I keep saying Corinth, and maybe I'm reading between this, I really believe this. They heard that Paul had been in prison for years, and then they heard he had arrived at Rome. And they said to themselves, what can we do to help Paul? And I wonder if there was some kind of meeting that went on, right? You know, and Epaphroditus says, you know what, I'm free, I can go and serve Paul and tend to his needs, right? As you look at chapter 2 and verse 25. The rest of the congregation perhaps said, you know what, we can't go to Rome to help Paul specifically, but I tell you what, I've got an extra coat you can bring to him. Or, as you look at 2 Timothy 4, I've got some books you can give him. Or, I've got money to give to him. Or, I've got food to bring to him. Right? And so they were seeking to help Paul. And I want you to notice more specifically, they helped Paul, they shared with him, which literally means to be a partaker with, during a time of his distress. One thing that I have learned as a preacher is if you help people in a time of distress, they may never forget that. And so much good comes as a ripple effect of sharing in a time of distress. You know, if you would go over really quickly with you to the book of Romans chapter 12, and I want to share with you something really quickly in regard to the idea of seeking to help others. This is a job of every Christian. This isn't just preachers. There should be a mindset, I believe, of when someone needs help, how can I help them? Now, we can't do everything. You know, the church at Philippi couldn't get Paul out of prison. They couldn't help in that regard, right? They did what they could. And what's interesting is as Romans 12, 6 through 8, it's talking about gifts that God gives Christians. Now, in context, some of these could have been miraculous spiritual gifts. By means of application, we can still glean some things from it, right? But notice in verse 6, having then gifts differing according to the grace that is given to us. What is that? Gifts. This is something God gave you. I've known people in life to take gifts that God have given them and they've only used it for their own selfish ends. But what do I mean by that? I can go right now and I can point to you people who are gifted in regard to the concept of leadership, a charming personality, a influential personality, and you know what they've done? They've used it to be a womanizer. They've used it to get drugs and to be a drug addict. They've used it for their own selfish ends. And I'm telling you, they're charming, but they want it for their own ends. And from this text of Romans 12, though, God teaches us that when He gives us a gift, we're to gift others with it. Well, what are those gifts? Well, just briefly, notice, for instance, there's the gift of prophecy. And, practically speaking, that's warning someone maybe from a message of God's Word, right? I have had people sit in my office who's going through a divorce. And I'll tell them, I have never walked in your shoes, but I'm going to tell you this. I'm going to warn you from the Word of God, don't go out and commit adultery because your spouse did. I'm going to warn you, according to the Word of God, you better look out for your children. In a time of distress, by the way, that's helping. You understand that? In a time of distress, think about this. There is also here in this text in Romans 6, there is the ministering, which I think is, by the way, is Epaphroditus here. This is what he's doing. Paul, how can I just serve you? Here you are, in Roman custody. What can I do to help? Do I need to go get you something? Do I need to go to the store and buy something? Whatever that may be. You may find, I remember recently, I was at the hospital in Morgantown. One of our families in the congregation there, son was in a car accident. And many of you know who that person is, obviously. And when I went there, I thought, all right, how can I help? Well, definitely prayer, right? But also at the same time you need a coffee? I'll go get you one. You guys haven't ate all day today. I know hospital food it's hospital food. It's not the best. I'll go get you a Chick-fil-A, How can you, it's just little things at times. That's the concept of ministering. And you can go down the list at any rate through Romans chapter 12, and you can see that the gifts, God gave some people the gift to serve. God gave some people the gift to teach or exhort. Or God gave some people, if you notice giving, the ability to make more money than others. That's okay, by the way. And so what? You use the money to help others, right? God gave somebody the gift of mercy in Romans 6. What is that? Have you ever thought about that? A gift of mercy? I really think God gave some people more of an ability to have compassion and consideration for others, and to be more in tune when others need help. You know what that also could mean? The gift of mercy could also be something along the lines of just listening to someone. You don't have to solve every problem in someone's life as a preacher. By the way, most of us as preachers, we're not licensed counselors and don't claim to be one, right? We can still help people and give them counsel. There's times I think we need to know when to refer. You know what I mean? We need to be good at that. But there's other times, one thing I've noticed about trying to help people in that regard is just listening. Sometimes you don't have to say anything. Sometimes people just need to mention their problems, and there's a sense of therapeutic relief, I guess I would say. How can I help? Well, let's go back to Philippians 4. I can spend all my time on that, and I don't want to do that. Look at verses 15 and 16 now. Because notice now, instead of seeking to help, now verses 15 and 16 speak of receiving help from others. And here's what Paul does. Paul gets historical. I had a preacher friend one time tell me, he said, listen, anytime he and his wife got into an argument, she didn't get hysterical, she got historical, right? She wanted to point out everything bad and everything. And I want to tell you something, as preachers, sometimes preachers can be really done wrong. And I'll say this, it's easy to remember the bad, isn't it? Paul here teaches us a great lesson. That when he's writing to the church at Philippi, he knows what the problems in the congregation here. He's dealing with them in the earlier chapters of the book, right? But Paul also chose to, notice secondly, remember the good that they've done for him. Notice he says, now you Philippians know that in the beginning, that's the beginning of the establishment of the congregation, obviously. When I departed from Macedonia, no church shared with me concerning the giving and receiving, but you only. In other words, the only church for a period of time that was helping me out was you. And Paul hadn't forgotten that. He remembered that. By the way, the phrase there, giving and receiving, is a business financial term, but I don't want you to think for a moment that this was just a business decision for the church at Philippi. In other words, they weren't going, well, Paul taught us the gospel, so we might as well go ahead and help him out while he's in prison. No, this was one of, Paul is in prison. He has taught us the gospel. He's very dear to us. What are we going to do to help him? That's the idea here. And Paul hadn't forgot that. In fact, even notice when Paul was in Thessalonica in verse 16, they sent aid to him once and again, which is probably a phrase of just meaning on multiple occasions they sent aid to Paul, basically helping him out. What's significant about that is you read in 2 Thessalonians chapter 3, when Paul was with the churches at Thessalonica, he didn't receive money from Thessalonica. Why? Well, there were a lot of reasons. One of those, as you read chapter 3, was he wanted to be an example to those who were basically scamming the church and being able to work but not willing to work, right? But he didn't refuse help from outside churches, clearly. Okay? Let me mention something, and I call this maybe a tale of two preachers. Okay? You take preacher number one. He goes to a congregation and he sees all the problems that the church has. In fact, he's one of those preachers, probably like many of us, is really good about spotting out problems in people's lives and problems with the church. Some of them just fall in your lap. They're so obvious. Others are maybe more subtle, right? And that you realize and see over time. And what he does, preacher number one, is he becomes fixated, and his main focus is on all these problems that the church has. And he does nothing but complain about the church and complain of how the church is terrible and they're terrible people and everything else. And eventually he gets discouraged enough, he leaves the church thinking it's a terrible church. And then take preacher number two. Preacher number two isn't oblivious. He's aware of the church's problems, right? But he's like Paul here. He still knows the good in them and the good that they do. He still sees the positive things about the church. He praises him for it. Let me ask you a question. Which preacher is better able to help the church with their problems? The preacher that only is fixated on the problems of the church, or the preacher that is aware of the good in the church and also understands there are issues as well? It's preacher number two. It's preacher number two. You understand that? When Paul wrote this letter, he just didn't talk about their problems. He also praised them as well. The churches you and I serve, I know there are times where, the problems just sometimes they just stand out. You know what I mean? Whether it be leadership problems or, problems with just complacency, whatever it is, remember this. That whenever we start getting discouraged about problems in the church, step back and say, you know what? There may be problems, but I still believe this firmly. The best people in the world are Christians, and we're around them every day. It's just that we don't choose to see that all the time. We choose to just focus on the problems. Number 3, let's move on. I want you to go down to verse 17 real quickly. And here's another thing. This is what I would call the third lesson is perceiving our support or perceptions of the gifts that we receive from others. Because notice Paul says in verse 17, not that I seek the gift, but I seek the fruit that abounds to your account. So my youngest son, Grayson, I'll just call him out. He's not going to watch this anyway. Last year as a kindergartner, we spent a lot of our times as a family. My kids play sports, and so especially in the wintertime, we're at the basketball courts. And so usually right after school, what we try to do is we try to have dinner, whether it's Taco Bell or McDonald's, or no Dunkin' Donuts. There is Dunkin' Donuts. We just don't eat there, sorry. Or we eat at home, whatever. And then we go and for the couple hours, we're there at our school that my kids go to, and so my two younger boys, Grayson be one of them, they just run around and play around the gym and everything. They've got their buddies and friends, and they have a good time. They really do. But one time, I saw Grayson with some candy, and I didn't give him any money for candy. And I come find out the workers of the concession stands, these are some of the moms, they basically said, hey, we saw Grayson walking by, and we don't know what happened, but he looked really upset, and we felt really bad for him, so we gave him candy. I thought, well, that's nice of you, thank you. The next night, though, he's got candy again. And you know what he did? Nothing happened that time, but he knew that if he gave them that sad look, they'd give him more candy, right? And here I have a kindergartner learning, in other words, to prey on people's compassion in order to get candy. He had already ate dinner. I had to tell them, I said, listen, don't give him any more candy. I don't care how sad he looks or that, I don't do it anymore. And I had to tell him, I said, you don't go up there and beg for any more food from the concession stand. I said, that's not right. You already had a chance to eat dinner. And the point is there's a motive there. And even though he's young, as a dad personally, I want to correct that motive. You know what I mean? And Paul is being very cautious, and when he's telling the church at Corinth, here in verse 17, I'm thanking you, but there's no ulterior motive here. I'm not seeking more. And that really the word here, seek, is a continual thing here, seeking more from you. And Paul is being rather clear. He says that's not what ultimately Paul is about. Incidentally enough, the word seek here, if you look at Matthew 6, verses 31 and 32, in the context of worrying about what we should eat, what we should drink, or what we should wear, these are the things the Gentiles seek, Jesus said. So don't worry about them. Well, what's the implication there? That's what they live for. And I think if you look at the word seek there and you think, what is someone passionate about? What is someone living for? Paul is saying that's not what I'm about. I'm not living for that. You understand that? Listen. One of the primary reasons for money, and this is beyond just preachers, by the way. This applies to every Christian. Okay? Is if you look at verse 16 and 17, Paul says, not that I seek the gift, but I seek the fruit that abounds to your account. I'm not seeking more money, but the fact that what you're giving me is helping me further advance the gospel. That's what Paul is about. And regardless of whether you're a lawyer, whether you work in a factory, or whatever it is, whatever finances God blesses us with, one of the things we learn that it is about the fruit of the gospel ultimately. Let me mention one thing to you as well, and I say this in context of this time. One of the things as you begin to research this verse, some commentary writers point out that there were a lot of what we would call traveling salesmen or traveling preachers or traveling philosophers who were very good about conning money from people, basically. In fact, some commentary writers essentially point that out where, for instance, in Greco-Roman culture, there were the sophists who oftentimes would be dressed really nice, and it was a lucrative business, but they would charge fees for teaching something to people and everything. And I think Paul, again, he's communicating, I'm not one of those individuals, basically. I'm not doing this for the money. And there is an Instagram a guy I follow on Instagram, and if you don't know what Instagram is, ask Dave. He'll tell you, right? I don't know if you have Instagram, but you inform him. But Instagram's a social media account similar to Facebook, but this guy, he has an Instagram account called Preachers and Sneakers. And what he does is he takes these big televangelist preachers, and now the day of your big mega church preachers or whatever, the suit and tie thing is a thing of the past. But he documents their wardrobe each week, and he shows how much it cost. And so literally you can pull up the account and you'll see this guy's wearing a pair of Nike Air Force Ones, but it's a rare collectible thing, and it cost over $1,500 for those pair of sneakers. Or the Da Vinci sweater that this guy's wearing, it's as ugly as they come, but it cost him $1,300 because it's a Da Vinci sweater. Or the pair of skinny jeans that look hideous, right? Those were a $900 pair of jeans, basically. And the point of this Instagram account, you can look it up. It's rather like, whoa. The point of it is a lot of these mega preachers are individuals who are trying to be more like Hollywood celebrities in their lifestyle than I think they are really trying to obviously save souls or serve God. Now, I'm about to say something that is what I would call a matter of opinion or a judgment call. So take it for what it's worth. And it's based upon the concept that Paul is very concerned of communicating he's not like one of those money-hungry preachers. You know what my favorite vehicle is right now? You didn't ask, but I'll tell you. It's a Tesla truck. Those things are so cool. You know what I mean? Have you ever seen them? They're really rare and they're very expensive, which is why I will not own one, out of my price range and everything. Well, the other night, I think it was last week, one of our guys at church, one of his relatives rented one for the weekend as they were coming into town. And so he called me up. I was in bed. He said, "Hey, I got a surprise for you." I get up and there's a Tesla truck. And I thought, well, did you buy this? And because he's a guy who has money, he can buy it. It is affordable for him. And so, no, he explained the situation. So we got in and drove it. Those are really cool. I just want you to know that, okay? And I asked him, I said, you going to buy one? He said, you know what? He said, I don't know if I will or not because I don't know if I want the attention of owning one. And I never really personally thought of that because, one, it's like, well, I'm not going to own one. They're out of my price range, right? And I'm not necessarily saying it's a sin for a preacher to own a Tesla truck, okay? But I will say from my perspective right now, personally, this is just me, okay? Right now, those things are really flashy. They're really expensive. And I thought, if I were to own one of those, what kind of perception would I be giving to people? What kind of image there? That preacher, he's just all about the money. Look at that Tesla truck, right? And maybe 10 years from now, it won't be an issue. They'll be cheaper and they'll be more common and in circulation and all that. And then, but my point is it's a judgment thing for us that we've got to be somewhat concerned about what we own in the sense of how does it portray the church? How does it portray Christ? I can go on about that, but let's go down. Let's go down to verse 18 real quickly. Notice Paul says, "Indeed, I have all and abound, and I am full, and having received from Epaphroditus the thing sent from you, a sweet-smelling aroma, an acceptable sacrifice, well-pleasing to God." So here's the fourth thing is, when it comes to caring for others, ultimately when we care, our number one desire is to please God. Notice here is Paul says, "I'm good. I've got more than what I need." You know what I mean? If you see my manuscript, I'll give more information about that. One of the things is notice their giving was a sweet-smelling aroma. In other words, he likened it to Old Testament sacrifices where people gave their best. God was well pleased with what they had done. By the way, the words well-pleasing here is very similar to Matthew 3 in verse 17. What was it? Matthew 4 rather, when God said, "This is my Son in whom I'm well pleased." Same thing in chapter 17 of the book of Matthew, when God the Father said, "This is my beloved Son in whom I'm well pleased." Same words there. And I want you to know something. Our motive for caring for others and serving God is ultimately to please God. Nothing else. Nothing else. It's not for clicks on Facebook or views on YouTube or anything like that. It's for pleasing God. I once heard this story one time of 3 preachers who were debating who was better than the other. And the first preacher said, "Hey, listen, I'm a gifted speaker. I am an orator, and I can have a way with words to keep the attention of a crowd for hours. And so because of that," he said, "I'm the better preacher." Well, the second preacher said, "No, I'm the better preacher because I'm smarter than you. And that I'm a debater. And I have whipped other preachers in debate, basically. And I am a scholar, and I have written books and everything. And I have an understanding of the Scriptures and a deeper meaning and level of knowledge of the Scriptures that others just don't have." You know. Well, the third preacher said, "No, I'm better than you two because of the fact that I've devoted my entire life overseas as a missionary. And while I've been a missionary, I've been thrown in prison. I've been on the run for my life. I have contacted various diseases. I have suffered more for Christ than you two, so I'm the better preacher." Well, let me ask you a question. Which one is the better preacher? And before you answer that in your head, let me read to you 1 Corinthians 13, verses 1 through 3, when the Bible says, "Though I speak with the tongues of men and of angels, but have not love, I've become a sounding brass and a clanging cymbal." Or how about in verse 2 when it says, "Although I have the gift of prophecy and understand all mysteries and all knowledge, and though I have all faith, so that I could remove mountains, but have not love, I'm nothing." Or how about verse 3 when it says, "And though I bestow all my goods to the poor, and though I give my body to be burned, but have not love, it profits me nothing." In other words, God gave preachers different abilities and gifts, and that should be celebrated in the sense of, that's great, you're using it for God. But if we don't do it with the motive of love, we're not doing ourselves any good. You know. Number 5, moving on. I want you to look at verse 19 now, Philippians chapter 4, because the fifth thing is the promising providence of God. Notice it says, "And my God shall supply all your need according to His riches and glory in Christ Jesus." Providence is one of those interesting things in Scripture that I don't fully grasp. It is the will of God that is done, but there was no miracle or something supernatural to make sure it was done. You know what I mean? That's what I think of it. I think of providence. God's will is done, but there was no miracle. God didn't force anybody to do anything. It still gets done. And here, Paul is telling the church at Philippi, God's going to take care of you as He's taking care of me. He's going to take care of you as He takes care of me. Let me share with you a story. When I was in preaching school here, okay, I was not good at planning ahead. And what I mean by that was, it was a Saturday, on a particular Saturday, I think it was in the springtime, and I'd been studying all day, probably had to write a paper at the last minute because that's what I did. And I thought, you know what, I'm hungry. I'm going to go upstairs and look for something to eat. And guess what? There was nothing to eat. So then I thought, well, I guess I need to go to the grocery store. Well, a storm had just hit, and it had knocked out power all throughout Moundsville. And so I go over, at that time it was Giant Eagle. And I go up and I get all these groceries to take back to the house, and they were only accepting cash. No cards, I don't think any checks, because the electronics were down. So I thought, well, look, I don't have cash on me. So I'll just walk down to the ATM machine near Giant Eagle and I'll pull out cash. Well, I started punching the numbers in, and we're unable to process your card at this time. I put it back in, unable to process your card. The third time I put it in, it took my card and shredded it, because at that time they thought it was theft. Somebody stole your card. And so here I am with a thing of groceries back at Giant Eagle, and I don't have any cash on me. I don't have a card now. I don't have checks. I don't have anything. I had to go back and say, well, I can't pay for these, and I just had to leave, right? Well, then I got to thinking, I got to preach in the morning, and my car's running on empty already. Like, what am I going to do? You know what I mean? So, back then I'm like, oh man, I'm kind of panicking, basically. Well, as I'm leaving to head back to the house, there was another preacher there. Some of you guys went to school with him. He had just graduated from the school, Mark Tabata. And Mark was preaching for a congregation south of here, but he still lived here in Moundsville. So he happened to be driving by that area, and I literally flagged him down. I waved at him. He saw me, and he pulled over, and I said, hey, and I explained to him the situation. Well, Mark's a wonderful guy. I don't know if you guys know Mark Tabata or not. And he said, well, let's go eat. And that was when they had Ponderosa. Remember Ponderosa? Why did that ever leave? That and Young's Cafeteria. What happened here, And so he takes me out to Ponderosa. He buys my dinner and everything. And, as two preachers get together, you know what we're talking about? We're talking about the Bible, right? And Mark's a little louder than I am, I guess, and that's okay with Mark. He's a fantastic guy. And here's what happened. As we were eating, a man comes up to us. And he has tears in his eyes. He's an older man. He didn't want to talk or anything, because we tried to talk with him. And he said, I appreciate what you boys are doing. And I admire what you boys stand for. And he dropped $25 right there on the table. That paid for my meal, and it also paid for my gas to go preach the next day. And I share with you that story because that's kind of a small thing that for me, 20 years of ministry has rung true over and over again. And I'm sure many of you preachers would completely agree with this. God's going to take care of you. God's going to take care of you. I can give you a lot more stories and more bigger stories from the perspective of, I don't know if I'm going to feed my family. I'm in between jobs or something. And I remember preachers would remind me, Dale, it's okay. God's going to take care of you. And He always has. And when I look at this verse, it's true. It's true. What we need, Paul says God's going to take care of you. Look at the last one, and I think we'll have to close. Notice verse 22. I just want to drop down to verse 22. As Paul closes out this letter, he says, I think, one of the more interesting things in regard to the effect of the gospel of Jesus Christ. He says this, all the saints greet you, but especially those who are of Caesar's household. Now, household here is probably the advisors of Caesar who are around him every day. It may be palace officials, could be another way, as William Barclay, I think, points this out, okay? And in other words, whether they were Christians in secret or not, people who were Christians were around the most powerful man in the world at that time on a daily basis. It's amazing to see where the gospel had gone. Charles Erdman said this in regard to this verse and his little commentary on Philippians. He said, to find saints in Caesar's household may be surprising, yet it should also be remarked that this was the very place where saints were most needed. Where heathenism and godlessness are more firmly entrenched, there the true apostle is most eager to have the gospel proclaimed. And where the world is at its worst, there the church should be at its best. And the most able messengers should be sent to those regions where the night is still darkest. The very picture of Paul, the prisoner, sending greetings from Caesar's household is a matchless appeal for sacrificial missionary effort. And he's right. Let me say this. You know, when Paul is here in Roman custody, people for the first time are getting to know this guy Paul, who claims to be this follower of Jesus. There's something different about him. He's not really a criminal. He doesn't really deserve to be here, right? But let me tell you something else. As these same individuals see Epaphroditus coming and serving Paul and delivering goods to Paul, they're also seeing that it's not just Paul that is to be admired. Let me say this as we close out. Some people don't care about the evidences for the Christian faith until they see how much Christians care for one another. Thank you.